In this section, we're going to be graphing radical functions. So we've looked at a couple of functions, and we know that functions have the form f of x. And really what we're interested is looking at what square root of x looks like. So if I were to graph it, what is going to be the shape of this graph? So one of the things that we want to do is that usually the most basic type of graph is by basically plugging in values. So plugging in values of x and trying to see what the y values are. You know, remember f of x and y are exactly the same. So these is just f of x is just a fancy way to say y. So let's plug in a couple points. So let's start off with, you can plug in negative numbers, positive numbers, and 0. Okay, so notice if I plug in a -1, okay, so let's say I plug in -1, well, I plugged in f of -1. This is going to give me square root of -1. Well, this doesn't give me a real number, so it's not a real solution. Okay, so this one you actually will get nothing. And what we remember from last time is that you can find the domain of this function by setting the inside greater than or equal to 0. So this means that all the values have to be greater than or equal to 0 in order for this graph to exist. So -1 is probably not a really good example. Okay, so let's plug in 0. Let's see what we get. So I'm going to plug in f of 0 into the function. So I'm going to get square root of 0, and that's going to give me 0. Okay, so when I plug in x equals 0, I'm going to get y equals 0. What happens when I plug in 1? Well, f of 1 is going to be equal to the square root of 1. That's just going to give me 1. So when I plug in 1, I'm going to get 1. What about when I plug in 2? These are going to be a little bit difficult because then you have the square root of 2. If you have a calculator, you can try to approximate this. So if you have your calculator, just put in the square root of 2. And what you're going to get approximately 1.414. Okay, so these numbers are really not really a good way to, I mean, they're good, it's just that you might have to approximate it by using a calculator. So let's put something that might be a little bit more useful. So for example, 4. If I plug in 4, I'm going to get f of 4. Oh, let me just put this as 1.414. If I plug in 4, I'm going to get the square root of 4, and we know that that's just going to be 2. Okay, and we can keep plotting them if we want to. So another one that we can plug in is 9. If I plug in f of 9, I'm going to get the square root of 9, which gives me 3. Okay, so you end up getting all of these different points. Okay, so how do we graph them? Well, if you remember, here is going to be my x and y-axis. So here is my x-axis, and here is going to be my y-axis. So my first point is -1. There was nothing at -1, so we're going to just put nothing there. Then the first point was 0, 0. So 0, 0 is right here. That's going to be my first point. That's where the graph is going to start. Then I get 1, 1. So when x was equal to 1, my y was also equal to 1. We're going to put a point there. Then 2, when this was 2, y was 1.41. 1.41 is a little bit higher than that. Okay, that's what we get. When x is equal to 4, so let's say here's 4, my y value is equal to 2. So when this is equal to 4, whoops, let me erase this. When this is equal to 4, my y value is going to be equal to 2. Okay, so I'm going to write it right here. When x was equal to 9, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, when this was 9, my y value was equal to 3. Okay, so what we end up getting is some sort of shape, and the shape looks something like that. Kind of looks like a little hook. Okay, so this is basically what the square root of x looks like. So this is the most basic thing that you can do. Just plug in points and see what we get. And yeah, that's basically all there is to it. Here, the domain. Okay, my domain is going to be from 0 all the way to infinity, because it's in the x values, it starts at 0 and then it goes all the way to infinity. Okay, now we do have something else called the range. So let's say we wanted to figure out what the range was. So if the domain is all possible x values, what do you think the range is going to be? Well, the range is just going to be all possible y values. Okay, so what the y values are going to do is, okay, what is the lowest y value? So if we were going up and down, the lowest y value is 0, and then it's going to go to infinity. Okay, you don't really need to worry so much about the range. I'm not really going to emphasize it much on exams, but I do want you to know the domain. Okay, so let's say I gave you another graph. How do I know what this graph is going to look like? Well, one thing that you can do is just plot points. So let me give you a little bit of a quick overview on what you can do. So to graph, one of the things that you first should look at is find the domain. Okay, so find the domain, that way you know what points I should be plugging in. Okay, after you find the domain, plot points that are in the domain. Okay, and then I'm going to write choose points or x values that will give you nice numbers. And this is usually really difficult to do. You usually have to have an eye for this. If not, just plug in regular x values. So for example, in my previous problem, when I plugged in 2, I got 1.414. That was not a really nice number. But if I plug in a 4, I got a 2 out, which was a nice number. Plug in a 9, I got a 3 out, which is another nice number. Okay, so, and then the last one is just graph. Okay. All right, so let's do this problem. So let's say we want to graph and find the domain. Okay, so I'm going to have f of x is equal to the square root of 2x minus 1. Okay. So the first thing that we want to do to solve this type of problem before we graph it is let's find the domain and see what it is. So remember the domain, we're going to take this inside portion, this 2x minus 1, and we're going to set this greater than or equal to 0. Okay, that is the first thing that we're going to do. And then we're going to go ahead and solve it to see what it is. So it's going to be plus 1 plus 1. I'm going to get 2x is greater than or equal to 1. And then I'm going to divide by 2. So x is going to be greater than or equal to 1/2. So my domain is going to be from 1/2 included all the way to infinity not included. So basically, when I'm plotting points, I should plot points starting from 1/2 all the way to infinity. Okay, that's what I should do. Okay, so now what's my second step? My second step is to plot points that are in the domain. Okay, so I already know where the domain is, between 1/2 all the way to infinity, so I shouldn't choose anything else that's less than that, because that's going to give me no solution. Okay, so let's start off by plotting in points. Okay, so the first point that I'm going to plug in is 1/2, because 1/2 is a really easy point to plug in. So I'm going to plug in f of x equals square root 2x minus 1, and then I'm going to plug in the 1/2 there. I'm going to have f of 1/2 is equal to the square root of 2 times 1/2 minus 1. Okay, so here the 2's are going to cancel each other out. I'm left with 1 minus 1, which gives me the square root of 0, which then gives me 0. Okay, so when I plugged in 1/2, I'm going to get 0 out. Okay. Alright, now let's plug in another number. Okay, so here you can plug in any number that you want. You can plug in 1 if you want. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so let's plug in x equals 1, square root of 2 times 1 minus 1. I'm going to get the square root of 2 times 1, which gives me 2, minus 1. That gives me square root of 1, which is 1. So when I plug in 1, I'm going to get another 1. Okay, now if I plug in 2, I can plug in 2 really easily, but notice when I plug in 2, I'm going to get 2 times 2 is 4, minus 1 is 3. That's not quite a really nice number, because I don't know what the square root of 3 is. I can put it in my calculator, but then I'm going to have a whole bunch of decimals. So let's try to choose a number that will give me a perfect number. So for example, one thing that I can do, I can plug in 5. Okay, so I plug in 5. Let's see what's going to happen. So I'm going to get the square root of 2 times 5 minus 1. So square root of 10 minus 1 is going to give me the square root of 9, which gives me 3. So when I plug in 5, I'm going to get 3. Okay, and you can keep doing these more and more. Usually 3 points is nice. So let's go ahead and plot this. So here is, let's say this is 1, so let's say this must be 1/2. So when x was 1/2, the answer was 0. Okay, so that's what we're going to have. When x was 1, y was 1. When x was 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, my y value was 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, there you go. So all I got to do is just connect these dots, and that's going to be my final answer. Okay, and then one of the last things that we were asking for is, what is the domain? Well, we already found the domain from the very beginning. You could have gotten it from just setting it greater than or equal to 0, or just by graphing this, knowing that it starts at 1/2, going all the way to infinity. Okay, that's all there is to it. Just follow these directions. These will really be a really good guide, and that's basically all it is.